Hello and welcome back to the Toffee Blues YouTube channel, your source for all things Everton. My name is Thomas Robertson, joined today by Paul the Esk. We've got plenty to talk about, as we seemingly always do. I think probably the last time we spoke, we were discussing why our mitigation didn't work for the last breach. We kind of went through why we had been punished. We then discussed the potential for an appeal. We're now a bit further down the line. We've been accused of a breach once again. I'm sure there'll be another appeal in the pipeline. But there is also plenty of other things to talk about around the takeover. And who knows, we may as well dive straight into it. Paul, thank you very much for joining me. How are you doing?
Yeah, not too bad, thanks. I was hoping for a nice quiet start to the new year, but sort of it's like a full-time job. It's 24 hours a day at the moment, so everything or the gift that keeps giving, not.
Yeah, I mean it's ridiculously frustrating. Of course, last time when we were judged to have broken the rules and deducted 10 points, I don't like to use the word galvanized because it is such a cliche, but it did have that impact on the fan base. Being hit with one again, it doesn't quite feel as quite feel the same this time around. It's just getting to a point of just pure frustration, especially with what Richard Masters has said this week in front of a select committee. I'm sure we'll get onto that. But we may as well start with the main elephant in the room. Of course, it was widely reported for a few days that ahead of this, well, it was Monday when we found out, wasn't it? And David
Yeah.
Ornstein, I think it was, came out saying that we were in breach alongside Nottingham Forest. Uh, of course, you'd been on the record claiming that you didn't think that this would be the case, if that's how I've understood it. So, how did this how did this come about? How have we ended up in this situation again?
Yeah, it is really interesting. I'm not name dropping here, but I'd spoken to David Ornstein quite extensively before the announcement was made. And I had my reasons for saying what I said, and I still stand by those reasons. And I'll talk about them in a second. And he kept saying to me, Paul, I think you're wrong. As much as I respect your research, that's not what the industry is telling me. The industry is telling me that Everton are going to be charged again. And I was like, well, okay, that's what you're saying, but I've got these figures, and I've got an explanation as to how we're going to present these figures. And if that explanation is correct, which I think it is, then we're going to be fine. So we had this like sort of standoff between us beforehand, and of course, it turns out that he and the Premier League have gone down one route. Well, not David Ornstein's gone down that route, but the Premier League have gone down one route, and the data that I'd been given and the suggestions that I'd been given in terms of why we weren't going to have a problem turned out not to be either not accurate, although I think they are accurate, or the club decided not to go down that route for whatever reason, and I've not quite worked out what that is. But essentially, the difference between being compliant and not being compliant comes down to the treatment of interest costs with regards to the stadium. And I know, obviously, in the independent commission, they said that they weren't prepared to accept Everton's explanation, and it got highly technical, but Everton's explanation as to why they didn't capitalise interest payments in the first instance, and then decided that they would do so, or that they would offer it up as a point of mitigation, which we talked about last time, and they didn't accept that. But the fact is that if you read the International Accounting Standards, which is a fascinating journal, I suggest everybody reads it at least once in their life. If you read the International Accounting Standards, and Section 23 in particular, Everton were absolutely within their right to claim that the interest costs for the stadium could be capitalised, and they could be capitalised for one simple reason, and that was, okay, so Mashiri's loans, which were interest-free, were the loans that were attributed to the stadium, and the commercial loans that we pay interest on, rights and media funding, etc., were attributed to the club. The question you have to ask is, would we have taken out those loans if we weren't building a stadium? Well, we would have probably still had the shareholder loans, because the club has been losing money regardless of the fact that we're building a stadium. But we wouldn't have had both. So the chances are that we wouldn't have had the commercial loans, because Mashiri would have still lent us the money in the first place. So the interest costs that the commercial loans attract are only there because we're building a stadium. Whether or not that money was used to build the stadium or not becomes an irrelevant point. The point is that we had those loans because we were building a stadium, and that was the point that I was using in my calculations. And if that point is accepted, and if the club had gone forward on that basis, then we would have, in my opinion, been comfortably below the 105 million figure for the period ending end of June 2023.
Yeah, and
I don't know if that helps explain it.
No, it does, of course. But I've seen the term double jeopardy be thrown around this week on Twitter, and I think there has been some confusion about why it seems like a similar period of time we seem to be being punished for again. So could you just explain that for us as well?
Okay, I think when the profitability and sustainability rules were first created, it was done on the basis that let's look at 3 years expenditure and average out the 3 years expenditure, or sort of aggregate, make an aggregate of the 3 years expenditure, so that if a club happens to spend a little bit too much money in 1 year, or has too great a loss in 1 year, it's not necessarily penalised just for that 1 year alone. It would have to be penalised for a sustained period of losses, and that was done on the basis that was fairer to clubs who were investing in their playing squads in order to obviously improve their on-pitch performance. And I think that was sensible, and that was a good way of bringing these rules in. Whether or not you agree with the rules that there should be a limit on losses, if those losses can be funded, is a different story. But looking at the picture over 3 years as against looking at the picture over 1 year, to me makes a lot of sense. Nobody, though, had thought through, well, what are the consequences if a club happens to be in a breach situation for more than 1 year? Because, as is demonstrated now by Everton, if you happen to be in a breach situation, i.e. your 3 year losses are more than 105 million, not just for 1 3 year period, but for the following 3 year period as well, then the same 2 of the 3 years are going to be used in the calculations twice. And that goes against the laws of natural justice, and it certainly goes against most conventions in terms of law. You can't be prosecuted for the same crime twice, and the argument will be is because they're 2 separate 3 year periods, does that constitute the same crime twice, or do you treat them as totally separately? And clearly the Premier League have gone down the route of, even though 2 years of the 3 year data are the same, it's different because it is a different period because it's a different 3 year period. And our argument is, and should be, well, yes, but 2 of those 3 years are being used twice. Is that fair? And should they then be taken into account when the penalty is applied at some point in the future, assuming that we're found guilty of the breach? And that That's the big issue at the end of the day. Can we use the same set of data twice and punish a club, Everton or anybody else for that matter, twice on that basis? And most people and the rules of natural justice would suggest that you shouldn't and you can't.
Yeah, it kind of keeps getting more confusing by the day. That, and I mean, I think it's maybe an exaggeration to say that the Premier League are just kind of going along with it and figuring out on the way. But as we've seen, I know people have mentioned that the EFL have kind of have rules to protect against this kind of situation, and that there wasn't actually any set guidelines over what punishment was meant to be given. That was, of course, decided by this allegedly independent commission, which seemingly we will have to face again. And a lot of
But
talk is
that's
kind of
that's a sort of separate argument, isn't it, mate?
mm,
And it's an argument that Masters, when he appeared in front of the Digital Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee this week, seemed to dismiss completely. He just doesn't agree with that at all. Now it seems to, on the basis of what happened over the European Super League ruling and what happened with regards to European law, that how can something be just if you don't know what the penalty is, or if the tariff, the penalty isn't either prescribed or limited at some point in the future. And if you're in a situation where the tariff is completely open, is that something that is consistent with European law? The courts in Europe have said, no, it's not consistent with European law with regards to the ESL. And of course, the Premier League, even though we're no longer part of the EU, the Premier League itself is actually European law applies to the Premier League. So are the Premier League actually acting in accordance with European law? It might be worth our while arguing that they're not, on the basis that there's no prescribed tariff for a particular crime or something that you're found guilty of. And as I say, Masters doubled down on that this week when he appeared in the House of Commons by saying, it's I can't remember the exact expression he used, something like an open tariff or an open something or other, which meant that they're quite happy to continue down those lines.
Yeah, and I'm sure we could kind of go on about Richard Masters' little cameo this week for hours and hours, but I'm not sure YouTube actually allows that kind of language to be used in that kind of way on a podcast. So we don't want to particularly dwell on that too much. But
it's fair to say, mate, that Richard Masters was the fourth choice of four when they were looking for a CEO. And the three other candidates who were thought to be superior to him all turned the job down because nobody that is of any quality really wanted the job of CEO of the Premier League. So Richard Masters was not the first choice, second choice, or even third choice of the Premier League clubs to be CEO. And it turns out that he's just the wrong CEO at the wrong time, at a time when the Premier League are being challenged more than they've ever been challenged before in terms of the suitability of their own rules and regulations. And there's two factors here, isn't there? One is the quality of the CEO, and secondly, the second point is, are these rules fit for purpose? Well, the CEO is not of sufficient quality, as demonstrated at the hearing and demonstrated on many occasions previously. And it's now also clear that the rules themselves are not fit for purpose. So the Premier League has clearly Everton have a real issue because we're the ones that are getting penalised on this occasion. But the Premier League have got a real issue going forwards because we might end up in a situation whereby 3 or 4 clubs all get punished in the same season, and you end up with 3 or 4 clubs out of 20 all having points penalties applied to them at some point in the middle of the season. As long as your name is not Manchester City, that could be any one of the other 19 clubs, and that just destroys the branding of the Premier League. How can the Premier League be considered to be the best league in the world, best domestic club league in the world, if it has rules which would, maybe a quarter of the league end up with a points penalty in 1 year because they've broken financial regulations? It's nonsense, complete and utter nonsense.
Yeah, it immediately undermines the integrity of the league. It's questionable how much integrity the league has left. But I mean, apart from just being not fit for purpose, Masters has been, well, entirely disrespectful this week, referring to Everton and Nottingham Forest as small clubs is honestly one of the most astonishing things that I think I've ever heard anyone say. But it doesn't surprise me with the way that the league have kind of gone about the last few months. And Manchester City is an interesting one that we should talk about briefly, because there's been a lot of chatter about their 115 charges. Now, not all those 115 are to do with PSR. I think some of them are, some of them aren't. There's been a lot of talk about why they kind of seemingly allowed to set their own date where they decide it. And there's been a lot of chatter about a potential change of rule towards the end of the season. Now, is that something you know much about? Because this is kind of spoken about a lot on Twitter, that all of a sudden Manchester City, despite having racked up over 100 charges, are seemingly going to be judged to a different criteria to ourselves and now Forest.
Well, it certainly is the case that not all of the 115 charges are the same charges that applied to Everton. So Richard Masters was correct in saying that. But it doesn't really matter what the charge is. The fact is that Manchester City are being charged 115 times. So they may have broken different rules to what Everton have broken, but Everton were only charged once on the breaking of one rule, albeit they've now been charged for two separate occasions, and that is the question is the difference of approach. So getting Everton first of all on the first charge, and that's expedited pretty quickly. And bear in mind that the Premier League actually wanted to do this at the end of last season, as against doing it in October when they did do it. And it was Everton who appealed against the idea that it would have been held even sooner than it was held, while City, with its sort of massive phalanx of lawyers, have been able to stretch out the time by which they will ultimately be held to account on the basis of the number of charges and the complexity of those charges. I think that, to be honest, the change of rules which will come in at the end of this year is somewhat of a red herring. I don't think we can use the change of rules as a means of mitigating what we've done, because you can only be charged for doing something under the rules that apply at the time. The Premier League rules are being changed at the end of this season because they're no longer consistent with the rules of UEFA and UEFA's financial fair play rules. And of course, because 7 or 8 of the English clubs appear each year in European competitions, there's got to be some consistency or some similarity between whatever UEFA's rules are and what the Premier League rules are. So UEFA are moving towards this effectively a wage cap based on turnover. So your wages can't be more than 70% of your turnover, as against a set of rules that say you can only lose a certain amount of money. And English clubs have to sort of fall in line with that. It doesn't necessarily have to be identical, but we have to be in a situation whereby the Premier League rules are similar to the European rules in order for English clubs to comply to those European rules. So I actually don't think it has anything at all to do with what's happened with Everton in the past. And going forwards, it may be a reflection of the fact that the PSR rules are not fit for purpose. But I think, to be fair, it's much more to do with the fact that the European rules are changing than it is to do with the PSR rules themselves.
Yeah, and just kind of towards one of the final things I'd like to talk about is, of course, the appeal that remains up in the air. I'm not sure what the timeline is on that for our first breach, of course. What I'm most interested about is kind of if this appeal is successful, to what extent it's successful will be hard to judge until we know what it is. But how will this appeal potentially impact the charge, well, the most recent charge, seemingly because the time periods overlap and there wasn't any rules put in place that kind of prevent the double jeopardy rule in this case. What kind of impact could the appeal not only have on the first charge, but now subsequently the second charge as well?
Well, I mean, it's a really interesting question. Thanks, Thomas, for asking. And I think it's really critical going forward. Under no circumstances can the second charge be heard whilst the first charge is under appeal. Because, and for one simple reason, and that is that the appeal itself may materially affect how the rules themselves are applied and how the the various accounting standards are applied. If part of Everton's appeal relates to the treatment of stadium interest costs, and then that appeal is subsequently approved, then that changes the basis upon which Everton are charged for the second charge. If the appeal is just about not the fact that we've broken the rules, but that the penalty for breaking the rules is inappropriate, therefore we're just saying, okay, we're guilty, we know we're guilty, but we think 10 points is too much and it shouldn't be a sporting sanction, it should be a financial sanction, or we think if it is going to be a sporting sanction, it should only be 2 or 3 points, whatever the argument is, then there's a difference with that. If we're appealing the sanction or the punishment, that's different to actually appealing the decision in the first instance. And if we are appealing the decision, then the second charge can't be heard until the first appeal is heard and determined. And again, that sort of causes the Premier League all sorts of problems, especially if, as is their wish, they want these charges to be heard and the punishment, if there is a punishment, to apply to this season. How is it that we can have an appeal and whatever process applies to the appeal, and then have a second commission hearing and a penalty applied, and possibly Everton appealing a second time? All within the space of we're in the middle of January now, so all within the space of 5 months before the end of this season. Just again, it's just doesn't bear thinking about it. It's not sensible, and it doesn't give Everton a fair opportunity to defend itself, either in the appeal or beyond the appeal.
Yeah, and it's seemingly a busy couple of months coming up for the Premier League if they are to squeeze that all in, but a busy couple of months for the club as well, because amongst all these breaches, it might be easy to forget kind of the main thing that's seemingly going on at the club at the moment, which is, of course, the allegedly imminent takeover by 777. Kind of towards the end of 2023, it seemed like the media were getting briefed that there were no issues, that this deal's going to go through kind of any minute. Into 2024 now, seemingly they've been briefed in a similar way again, that they expect the deal to go through without hitches. Richard Masters obviously suggested the other day that, well, he didn't suggest, he kind of blatantly said that 777 haven't really come up with the appropriate answers to the questions that the Premier League are asking. Whether that's actually true, or he's just kind of trying to put up this facade of trying to be on the side of the fans, which we know, of course, he's not. Who knows? But there was a fairly large contingent from the group at the match last night. We're recording this on Thursday. It is, yeah. Almost forgot about that. So we're recording this on Thursday. Last night, Josh Wander re-emerged at Goodison Park. Seemingly, he brought a couple of mates along with him this time. Can we glean from that potentially the deal is any closer, or might there be an alternative explanation for that?
I thought that it was an act of desperation. It was an act of, it was a PR stunt. It was an act that said, look, guys, it's business as usual. We've lent the club money. We're wanting the deal to go ahead, and we're here for you. It was, there was no substance to it other than it was a PR stunt. It's quite simple. We're 17, nearly 18 weeks into the due diligence process, or the process fit and proper person test. Had 777 provided the information that the Premier League need, the Premier League would have made a decision one way or another. Yes, they are fit and proper. No, they're not fit and proper. The duty, the obligation is upon 777 to provide the information that is required. And it's my understanding that they still haven't provided audited accounts. And the reason why they haven't provided the audited accounts is because there are no audited accounts for the partnership. And if I'm wrong in that respect, and I'm sure 777's lawyers will be listening to this at some point, then I'm happy to apologize and retract what I've just said. But that to me is the only logical explanation for why it's taking so long. If the information is required and then not delivered, it's difficult for the Premier League to make a decision. The problem for Everton, and the problem increasingly for 777, is that the longer this process goes on, the greater the amount of debt Everton take on board, some of which is being provided by 777 themselves, but also the prospects of Everton going into administration and being in a far worse position than we are currently, grow on a weekly basis. And it's not helping us, the fact that the 777 situation is not resolved. I fervently want 777 not to be Everton's next owners. And I implore Fahad Moshiri to speak to other people, to speak to people who want to speak to him about acquiring Everton Football Club. I wrote about this in September. Let's not waste time thinking that 777 are the right future owners for Everton Football Club, because in my opinion, they're not. We should have spent the last 4 months talking to more suitable potential owners. And at the end of the day, that's what we're going to have to do if 777 don't get approved. And I've just explained the reasons why I don't think they will be approved. Then Moshiri has to speak to somebody else. Otherwise, the club goes into administration. It's as stark and simple as that.
Well, if we do go into administration, at least we'll get less of a points deduction this time. So, there's always a silver lining to everything.
Well,
but it is.
We could end up with 29 points in one season. That's a laughing matter. It's not. But that's the reality of the situation. There's no point in sugarcoating it. Either 777 can provide the information that is required, and that information is suitable or appropriate, or not. And for Richard Masters to say, well, hopefully it's going to be resolved in the next few weeks, or within weeks, he said, didn't he? Hopefully within weeks. Suggested to me that he doesn't have a clue when it's going to be resolved.
No, we are seemingly all left in the dark. I was slightly surprised that all of a sudden Isaac Hayden was being widely praised this week by Everton fans for his comments about the fact that he was missing wages from his time at Standard Liège. Seemingly, Genoa are in a similar kind of financial difficulty. I think they've just kind of escaped a points deduction, but I'm not too certain about that. 777 is seemingly being pursued in the courts by airline companies, etc. It is kind of a fascinating conundrum we have ended up in, and I'm sure we have a, a very busy few months coming up. Not only for Dyche and the players to be battling this on the pitch, there is so much going off the pitch. We've got an appeal. We seemingly have another breach, which I'm sure will be appealed again. We have a takeover that needs to be imminently dealt with, seemingly all needing to be wrapped up before the end of the season. So, Paul, I'm sure we will definitely get the chance to speak again, probably plenty of times over the next few months. But thank you very much for your time today.
No, great pleasure. I just wish we could talk about more positive things, and even maybe one day, who knows, we might even end up talking about football, you and me.
When that day comes, I will be very shocked, but I would be very pleased nonetheless. I mean, well, we're seemingly on for another cup run again. So, I mean, Andre Gomez has scored. I don't know what year it is. Seemingly that Andre Gomez is now whipping in free kicks for us, but it is 2024. I do promise.
Yeah. It's amazing, wasn't it? That, I mean, obviously, I couldn't get to the game because I'm nowhere near Liverpool. But the fact that nobody could watch it, who didn't go to the game because it wasn't on a TV station anywhere in the world, is just amazing.
Yeah, quite hard to. I was struggling to believe people, posting these clips of Gomez on the score screen. But anyway, yeah, through to the next round of the FA Cup. Yeah, maybe one day we'll talk about football, Paul. But thank you all very much for listening. Do check out Paul on Twitter as always, the Esk. Check out the other videos we have up on the channel and all of our social media. As I said, thank you all very much for listening, and join us next time on the Toffee Blues.